Okay, so I wanted to go through Linz, The Perils of Presidentialism really quickly. I think it's a really good article. Yeah, it's old. It's from, I think, 1990, is it? Yeah, so it's an older one, but I think it goes through a lot of some of the issues that we talked about regarding presidential versus parliamentary government and which is better and which should get adopted in what sort of scenario. I think he does a really good job of going through those sorts of issues and bringing some contemporary examples. So essentially, this article starts with this premise that we notice that parliamentary democracies tend to survive better. Not so true for presidential systems, except for the United States. They tend not to survive. They tend to break down. And so why is this? So he starts off by describing what a parliamentary versus a presidential system is. So the idea in parliamentary system is that government's authority is completely dependent upon parliamentary confidence. So confidence of the House, as we know, from responsible government. Whereas in a presidential system, a lot of presidential or executive power, or all executive power, is based in one individual who is elected by the people for a fixed term and is independent or separate from the legislative branch. All right, so what are the two things that he really wants to highlight then about presidential government that are going to be really important when he's answering this question of, why is it that presidential systems tend to collapse? So the first thing is this idea that there is a strong claim of a president to legitimacy, so to democratic legitimacy. They are directly elected. Now, sometimes, of course, this is disputed by a legislative branch or who also have some sense of legitimacy in that they are also elected. And sometimes it's disputed by this dispute gets resolved by armed forces who fight it out between the legislative legitimacy and presidential legitimacy. And he says this is going to be one of those key things that's going to impact whether a presidential system survives or not. The second is this idea of a fixed term in office. And he brings up the idea of, well, if you have this fixed term and if it's hard, it's really not flexible enough to allow somebody to come in and come out. What happens if a president steps down or gets forced out or dies? And that can lead to a lot of instability. So he also brings up a number of issues with presidentialism that he thinks is probably leading to this fact that presidential systems have a really hard time surviving, whereas parliamentary systems tend to be super stable. So one of these problems is that a strong and stable leader can also mean having a personalization of power. So you can see, the cult of the President of the United States is much greater than the Prime Minister of Canada, we might say. So oftentimes that when you are directly electing one particular executive through direct elections, you're going to get a personalization of power, and it starts to almost look like a dictatorship. And then the question is, what happens when a leader has to, when a leader gets taken out, or there's a particular crisis in leadership. It's really hard to deal with in a presidential system. The second issue he notices is that it's really a winner-takes-all game, a presidential system. So either you win it all or you lose it all. So there's no kind of you get half the presidency, like you can get half the legislature. No, you either get it or you don't. And so rather than building coalitions, in a lot of countries with parliamentary systems, they'll have more coalition governments because there's more parties involved. Canada is kind of unique that we don't often have coalitions. But rather than coalition forming, one person wins and one party wins. And so you're pretty much a loser for a set period of time. You just kind of have to wait it out. You have no partial power. And so sometimes what can happen is, especially if you have a particularly volatile electorate, then a leader might be required to really bring in fringe parts of the movement or fringe parties into their support as president. And so you can sometimes see this with parliamentary systems too, in coalition building, that fringe parties will need to be involved. But you can also see that, so for example, with the Trump election, needing to really focus in and include in some more extremist movements into that in order to get support, because usually it's going to be a pretty thin margin between who wins and who loses, and it's a zero-sum game. You either win or you lose. And so oftentimes leaders might appeal to movements that they probably normally wouldn't have, just in order to win, because again, you win or you lose. So then he goes into the Spanish example, which I'm going to just skip over, but take a look at that if you're interested in Spanish politics, or look at it in general. And then he gets into another issue with presidential politics, which is the idea of who that president is, and the fact that, and he uses the pronoun he, but he or she, is at both at once head of state and also chief executive. And so the problem is that they might start to say, okay, well, everybody who supported me, they're the people, or that, the people who support me, they're the real Americans, or the real citizens of this particular country. And so that can become very polarizing, and it can allow for certain people to be dismissed. Whereas a prime minister has to really deal with an opposition, because they're sitting in a legislature with their opposition. Whereas a president doesn't necessarily have to have these close relations with the opposition, so that opposition can really get vilified and say, the real people who I'm representing are the people who support me. And this can also lead to an issue of being concerned, kind of almost paranoid, about retaining power. So, for example, in a parliamentary system, the cabinet ministers are, sure, they're loyal to the prime minister, but they retain their seats. They have legislative representation regardless of whether they're a cabinet minister or not. Whereas in a presidential system, usually the cabinet ministers rely entirely on the president for keeping any sort of power or any sort of authority in the system. If they get kicked out of cabinet, they're done. They're not in politics anymore. And so it can allow for much more centralization of power. Of course, then we know, though, if you took 205, you know that Canada also has some issues with centralization of power in the Prime Minister's office. So it's not that parliamentary systems are immune to these issues. But it can also influence the amount of power that a president has, and therefore can make it much more personalized. And then there's issues of stability. So the next thing that Linz talks about is this idea of, we often talk about an advantage of presidentialism being that the executive's pretty darn stable. So, the example being, for example, Australia got like new prime ministers every 2 years because the caucus, or the party in the House, in their legislative branch, was able to choose who their new leader was. And you can also have, minority or coalition governments where, they're going to have to, they don't survive forever. But the thing is, he kind of pushes back against this idea that, parliamentary systems aren't stable, and that presidential systems are super stable and therefore good. And he says, well, actually, parliamentary systems have the same parties, and you have this ability to get rid of a scandal-filled prime minister who doesn't have any confidence anymore, which is really not easy to do in a presidential system unless you impeach them. So the other issue, of course, with when you do get rid of a president is, who then is going to take up the slack. In a parliamentary system, it's pretty easy to know who's going to be next. They just choose a new leader, right? Whereas in a presidential system, do you really want the vice president suddenly to become president? Who really voted for Trump thinking they were going to get Pence, right? So it's that tricky deal of maybe presidential government is stable, but it actually might not be stable in the sense that when you do get some sort of a crisis, there's really no good way to go about dealing with that crisis in a sort of stable manner like there would be in a parliamentary system. The next issue he talks about is the time factor. So you have a limited term, and so you'll do what you can do rather than thinking of the long game. So as a president, you have this incentive to think, okay, well, I have this specific term, and I know when it ends, and so I'm going to try to push through what I can. Whereas in a parliamentary system, there's really no time limit. Justin Trudeau could stay prime minister as long as people keep electing a Liberal government. And probably he's not going to step down anytime soon unless the Liberals lose an election. So oftentimes it can mean that you have this sense of in a presidential system that I have this term, I need to do as much as I can in this particular term. There's also sometimes a bigger issue in terms of fear of who's going to come after you. I have a limited amount of time in this office. How am I going to set up for my successor? Whereas you don't have to worry about that quite as much in a parliamentary system because you can just stay on as long as you'd like. So then he concludes and says, so just, before you think that, any parliamentary system will do, obviously, parliamentary systems have their own issues. You need to make sure that you have responsible government. You need to have parties that are able to work. Whatever system you have, really the crux of it all is having good leaders and having some sense of democratic legitimacy. But he does note that, these are some of the reasons why we do notice that a lot of presidential systems end up floundering and reverting from democracy back to authoritarianism, a reverse transition almost, because of these sorts of issues that he talked about. So issues including the fact that, a president has this fixed term in office, the fact that they claim democratic legitimacy directly from the people, that it's really hard to deal with crisis, especially leadership crisis, that in a winner-takes-all game, that it's going to be hard to build coalitions and build support amongst a variety of people. And that you do get this kind of personalization of politics in a presidential system that can be anti-democratic after a while. So that's a quick going through of Linz, The Perils of Presidentialism, but it's a really good example of an older article, but a good one about what some sort of situations or what sort of considerations we need to take into place when we are designing parliamentary versus presidential government. All right, so let's try to close this one, and you can head over to the quiz.